Good morning and welcome to another in our series of NCITE speaker series. My name is Erin Grace and I will be your host for today. Thank you for joining us. I want to welcome, we have a very diverse and a large audience today, so thank you for signing on. We have representatives from Homeland Security, specifically CISA and FLETC. We've got our NCITE Program Manager, Corey Davenport, and Contract Help, Sue Newman. Also, the State Department is here. We've got the United Nations, a member of the CDC, ODNI, and state government from Nebraska, New York, and others. Also happy to see members of our consortium and the University of Nebraska at Omaha, so welcome. We will be recording this and sharing out a recording afterwards. And before we launch into a talk, I know that we're all highly anticipating. I want to just run through some quick housekeeping items with you. First of all, we're on Zoom webinar, a one-to-many platform, and so audio and video and group chat have been turned off. We do want questions from you, and so there is a Q&A function that you will see. Please submit your questions into the Q&A. You may not see them on the screen, but we will try to ask them in the time that we have. And so without further ado, I would like to get right to our program here and introduce just a wonderful human and a prolific scholar, an applied psychologist, Dr. John Horgan. He has written over 120 publications, including the following books, and I think they're worth naming. The Psychology of Terrorism, which is now in its second edition and published in a dozen languages. Divided We Stand, The Strategy and Psychology of Ireland's Dissident Terrorists, and Walking Away from Terrorism. His latest book, I've got it right here, Terrorist Minds, The Psychology of Violent Extremism from Al-Qaeda to the Far Right, was published by Columbia University Press in 2023. His current research examines issues around terrorist psychology, bystander reporting, and school safety. You should also know that Dr. Horgan has held positions at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, Penn State, the University of St. Andrews, University College Cork. Right now, he is what's called a Distinguished University Professor, based currently at Georgia State, where he directs the Violent Extremism Research Group, or VERG. So, John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Erin, it's good to be here. How are you?
I am wonderful. It's raining in Nebraska. We haven't had water in 2 months, John, so this is a good sign.
Oh, we've had our first rainfall in all of October here in Atlanta, and the sun is shining. So,
Well, good. All right. Well, listen, we're all at the edges of our seats. And before I hop into your book, I guess I want to start with bookends and go right to the here and now. So your book was published in December of 2023. We are days away. You may know there's an election happening in Georgia, John, and all over the country. But we've got ballot boxes on fire in the Pacific Northwest, Maricopa County in Arizona, where will be the election, night. HQ is practically a garrison. Our own at NCITE threats to public officials research is ticked up to 93 is the latest count of folks who've been federally charged for threatening anyone from a health administrator to an election official. And by the way, of that number, over a third are tied to elections. You've got ISIS-inspired planners. An Afghan national was arrested recently in Oklahoma City, Arizona. A teen wanted to drop a bomb on a pride parade for ISIS. So, and then we have the Middle East. So if you were going to write an addendum to this book, catch us up between when your book was published to now, what would you say?
gosh, it's a hard question to answer. And honestly, I don't know that I would really change much. One of the themes of the book, one of the reasons I wanted to write it was that in a way is a sort of a reminder that it's one of the defining features of terrorism. It is diverse, it's complex. It is a strategy that isn't tied to one ideology or cause or orientation. It is something that a wide variety of actors find attractive for many, many different kinds of reasons. If we were to think back over the events of the last 12 months, I mean, there's certainly some that we could have seen coming. We knew that there was going to be at an absolute minimum, subversion around the electoral process. Um, uh, and with respect to the events of October 7th, with the Hamas terror attack on Israel, I mean, the world has shifted on its axis since. But for something that not even the Israeli military could have seen coming, I think it's, we're all experts in hindsight when it comes to terrorism. But I think for all of those reasons, I'm not sure that I would have had much to say by way of an addendum, but just as a reminder to say, well, the changing nature of this phenomenon is something that has always been there, and it will always be with us because, like I said, it's a strategy.
So let's go to the first book, and then when I opened this page, I think I told you I was started your book on a flight. So it was disconcerting, to say the least, to read the quote that you chose to begin with from the terrorist of terrorists, Osama bin Laden. And the quote you used was, "The study of psychology is very dangerous and very important." What drew you to study this subject and to write this book?
Oh, I would love to say that there is a story to that. I would love to say that there's a sort of personal history that sort of pushed or pulled me into this. It was complete accident. Obviously growing up in Ireland, a lot of people understandably think that I was somehow influenced by the Troubles, and that's where I developed my interest. But I mean, I grew up in County Kerry in the Republic of Ireland. And even though Ireland's a tiny country, I may as well have been a million miles removed from where the conflict was really, taking place. It's impossible to grow up in Ireland without having been aware of what was going on. I mean, I certainly remember as a kid, uh, uh, news reports, atrocities. I think one of the first um, terrorist events I can remember. I must have been about 9 or 10 years old. I remember seeing the news coverage of the Brighton bombing I think it was 1984, where the IRA tried to kill the British PM, Margaret Thatcher, and her senior cabinet. And I've a very, very, very vivid memory of seeing survivors being pulled out of that rubble, and I think my mother said something to me which really stuck with me at the time. She said, the people who did this are probably watching this right now, and they're laughing at it. And I remember being very disturbed by her saying that. And all of it, none of this is to say that that's how or why I got interested in this as a topic, but it was certainly always there. And political violence was something that was always in the background. How I got interested in this, again, really it was a complete accident. I went to university more out of spite than anything else. There's a whole story there, but for all kinds of reasons, I wanted to join the army. My uncle Hugh was a role model for me growing up, and he served with UNIFIL peacekeepers in Lebanon, and so he would come back, and I would hear all of these stories of what it was like to do what he did, and so that filled my head with all kinds of dreams and ideas about the world. I didn't get into the army, and I decided, all right, let's go to college and see what happens. And I remember, and I signed up for a psychology class, and it just so happened that one of my professors, Max Taylor, happened to be a terrorism expert and happened to explain just about every single concept in psychology through a terrorism lens, which I'm not sure everybody else saw the humor in that, but it really, really left an impression with me. So early on in my sort of college days, learning about psychology, I thought, oh, there's a psychology of terrorism. What's that about? And there's about maybe 4 people in the world doing research on it at the time. But I remember that sort of it drew me in and hooked me, and the idea. I'm making this far too long-winded, but the idea that somebody could develop an interest and engagement with extreme violence in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect pathology or personality or anything like that. I think that idea really left an impression with me. So the idea that, becoming a terrorist is really, it's the end product of a thousand little steps, in the words of one well-known terrorist. And I've been hooked on it ever since. I think it's that notion of how and why people become involved and what are the sort of the forces that push and pull them in. And that's 25 years ago now, and I've still been unable to leave it.
So, just to follow up to that, why write this book? You had already written 2 volumes of, the psychology of terrorism. How is this book different than that? And who were you seeking to write it for?
Yeah, fair question. So I'd written a book way back in 2005 called The Psychology of Terrorism. That was as as many of my friends have reminded me over the years, very dense, technical book, inaccessible. It was one of the kinder, and listen, that's fine. I mean, I like to think in hindsight, and this is probably made up, but I like to think in hindsight that, well, my goal at the time was to, I was so desperate to impress. I mean, I wanted to write something technical. I wanted to be taken seriously as a scholar just out of my Ph.D. I have since learned in my old age that you can talk about complicated things, but you can also try to write in such a way that might be accessible to people. I wrote a second edition of The Psychology of Terrorism 10 years later. And the reason I wanted to do that was, I wanted to capture just how much the research had changed in the intervening 10 years. And I also wanted to try to make it a little bit more accessible to people who might read it. Well, I think about 9 people read the second edition. So 10 years on from that again, I thought, okay, I want to try to tell this story one more time. And I want to do so in such a way that captures, even more of a change, even more diversity, more complexity now than I have ever seen in my time studying terrorism, and also to try to do a better job to, quite frankly, just communicate that research in as plain English as I can muster to the practitioners, the government folks, the analysts, the people who have the unenviable job of actually doing something about this. And time will tell if I've succeeded or not. But I think, I knew early on that doing a third edition of The Psychology of Terrorism just wasn't going to fly. And I thought, all right, I need a back to basics approach here. I need to just, rip it all away and just start from scratch. And really just allow, obviously there's been so much great research in the last 10, 15 years. I wanted to tell that story and to try to package all that up. And then I also wanted to call attention to some of the really groundbreaking research that scholars have been doing, that's been funded by people like DHS, Science and Technology, and others. It's really solutions-oriented research. I think for so long, terrorism research has really been about trying to convey just how complex it is, and that's perfectly fine. But again, one thing I've learned in the process of doing this book is that we can talk about the complexity, and we should, but that should never come at the expense of also realizing that, okay, it's complicated. We have a hard time even talking about it, let alone agreeing on it. But guess what? There are also things we can do to make communities safer. And the last part of it was a bit of a sort of like a personal manifesto. And the final third of the book is me just addressing what I felt was some unfinished business, to say that, look, the research is getting better. There's absolutely no doubt about it. There's more and more people doing research on the psychology of terrorism. I mean, this was a super, super fringe area up until fairly recently, quite honestly. But there are things that if we are to realize what a psychology of terrorism can be and what we can offer in terms of solutions, there's something we need to do that we've done piecemeal up to now, and that is we need to do a far better and comprehensive job of sitting down and interviewing people who've been involved in terrorism. That is not, I should say, that's not a criticism of people who don't do that research, because we're all in this together. We've got to figure out ways of cracking this problem. But from a psychological perspective, we're just spinning our wheels unless we're willing to really, cross the Rubicon and seriously and comprehensively take on that one big challenge.
Thank you for saying that, especially about the accessibility. Let's be honest, this is not exactly a sunny topic. And when you think about how to build resilience in communities beyond practitioners and beyond, I guess the community of interest that exists in scholarship around this, John, you want to reach people like me, you want to reach communities like Omaha to build them up. Accessibility is really key, and getting them to tune in from something we all want to avert our eyes from, right? I mean, who wants to really think about terrible events that happen for reasons that are hard to understand? And so to that end, you write about terrorism being this hard problem, hard to understand, hard to explain. It's very complex. I was grateful to see humility from a scholar in this work, especially after 25 years. And you capture it in a way that an Omahan would really understand it by referring to it as a tornado. Would you mind reading just a selection from the very tail end of your book to this end to capture that idea?
Sure, of course. Yeah, so I'll happily read that, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to do so. So just to sort of briefly set the scene, I mean, this is the very, very, very end of the book, and one of the things I've learned over the years is that there are lots of ways in which we can try to communicate the complexity of terrorism, and there's lots of analogies out there. I mean, people familiar with the literature will know that there's all kinds of analogies and metaphors from conveyor belts, pyramids, double pyramids, staircases, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I've got my own, and it's a tornado, and so the very end of the book is this. So conclusion. Terrorism today isn't like just one tornado. We are witnessing the rapid development of multiple, sometimes overlapping tornadoes touching down in places we least expect and causing more damage than we could ever imagine. Their force envelops men, women, and children, some of whom are impacted on the periphery, while others get violently swept up, ending up in a place far from where they started. Some of the victims survive, but many don't. Some get swept up simply because of where they live. They didn't seek it out. The storm arrived at their doorstep. They may not have had sufficient fortification to protect them from being unwittingly sucked up, but nevertheless, it happened. Others come from very far away on purpose to get closer, to feel the power and intensity of an experience that calls to them. They are prepared to face the risks involved despite the uncertainty of how those winds will suck them in and toss them out, maybe even killing them in the process. Some, having survived, go back and seek it out again. What are career foreign fighters, after all, if not habitual storm chasers? For 5 decades now, we have searched for clues as to those select few who seek out those storms. But the search for answers around why people seek out tornadoes doesn't tell us anything about how and why they form in the first place. And perhaps after all is said and done, that's just fine. We don't have to try to explain it all, at least not alone. And psychology cannot now, nor will it ever, explain terrorism. The challenge for those of us interested in the storm chasers, in other words, the terrorists, is to better describe, understand, and ultimately explain how, why, where, and when these select few are willing to risk their lives in pursuit of a few fleeting moments with something much bigger and much more awe-inspiring than they realize, until often it's just too late. If we can achieve this, we will one day be in a far better position to do something about it. Description must be our goal for now. It is fundamentally still about the, quote, who, when, where, and how, and its answers furnish the raw material for theorizing and explaining, end quote. Like tornadoes, terrorism is a highly unpredictable phenomenon. Its aftermath, in part, is impacted by what we do in pursuit of minimizing its impact on us. All too often, however, we fail to act until it's too late. We reel from the shock, we take stock, we mourn the dead, and we rebuild. There are no easy answers, but there are things we can do. We can get better at spotting the warning signs. We can prepare for their arrival. We can fortify our barriers. We can educate the public about their inherent dangers. There's about 10 more pages in the conclusion, but I think you wanted me to stop. You wanted me to stop at that point. So
I mean, honestly, I could listen to you read all day. Part of it is that beautiful Irish accent you have, and just, but just the acknowledgement that this is not a cut and dry thing, and this is not an easy thing, and that goes against, I think, the human psyche, right? Our need to understand something that is almost incomprehensible, why someone would pick this target and do some kind of horrific, unconscionable act of violence. To that end, the tornado I find so apt. A tornado can strike a street and one house is flattened and the house across the street is just fine, which can then make the nature of stopping it hard, right? But
yes.
you can turn the siren on and people can go to their basements, and I like that your solutions focused. So kind of just to rewind, I think when an event happens, we try to understand the who, what, when, where, why, and how. For purposes of your book and this discussion, what are the most easily accessible definitions of who a terrorist is and what terrorism even is?
Sure. So this is one of those things that it's sort of like a rite of passage for anyone who studies terrorism. You're expected to pretty much drown in a sea of definitions. Terrorism researchers like to say that there's hundreds and hundreds of definitions. That's technically true, but they're all more or less variations on a theme. And so the definition that I like is that, let's see if I get it right now. Terrorism is the use or threat of use of violence by non-state actors in pursuit of some social, political, religious, or other ideological agenda. That is not to say, of course, that state actors don't also engage in terrorism, but what we commonly associate with the word terrorism is something that's more or less located in the domain of non-state actors. But to boil the definition down to its simplest components, we're talking about the use or threat of use of violence against non-combatants or civilians for some ideological purpose. It's the ideological dimension to this that distinguishes terrorism from other kinds of violence. Things that might look similar, feel similar, certainly from the perspective of someone who is fleeing gunfire. I mean, are you terrified? Yes, of course. It doesn't necessarily mean it's terrorism. So it's the ideological dimension that separates it from or distinguishes it from other types of targeted violence.
Right, so thank you. You've answered my second question, which was what makes a terrorist different than a common criminal, different from a mass shooter, which we're all too familiar with here.
Yeah, well, I mean, so there are differences and there's also similarities, and that's sort of this. So this kind of goes back to your very, very first question about, well, look, just pick a few examples from the headlines where we can see very quickly just how blurred those boundaries can be. One of the projects I'm involved in right now is looking at school shooters, and it's a topic that I never really thought that I would be engaged in, but ironically, I sort of came to it indirectly because of the increasing overlap between ideologically influenced mass shooters and non-ideologically, or at least a category of offenders that what traditionally wouldn't be considered ideologically motivated, but that overlap, that middle bit of the Venn diagram, is starting to increase in ways that I think is challenging for people who like to have neat categories of, well, you're ideological or you're not, and if you are ideological, you're either this or that or something else. Well, the last few years, this goes way beyond the last 12 months, but the last several years have started to force us to rethink a lot of these assumptions.
Just to stick with definitions for a second, we actually have a viewer question, John, who says, in the definition of terrorism that you prefer, how do you define violence?
Violence, where we're talking about physical harm, aggression directed against a person, community, class, etc. Um, the violence is actually an easier thing to objectively define and classify than terrorism, ironically, because despite the fact that it's the violence associated with terrorism, that physical harm, that's just one small component of what terrorists do. The majority of people convicted for terrorist offenses in the United States, for example, don't actually engage in violence. Their acts involve, there are, it's a wide variety of different types of offenses that contribute to the success of terrorist activity, but aren't necessarily violent per se. And terrorism today, even in the smallest of groups, allows for a variety of people to engage in a variety of different types of activities. So producing propaganda, disseminating propaganda, recruitment, radicalization, mobilization. Those acts don't necessarily involve inflicting violence per se on somebody else, but clearly those actions are done in service of that bigger, broader, violent agenda.
Thank you. And if we had my colleague Seamus Hughes on, we could have a fun discussion of definitions in a legal context, right? Because of the way the laws are constructed or not constructed around terrorism in this country. But just
which
to,
which which is a huge challenge for researchers because again without sort of getting bogged down in the definition issue, but something that sort of offline a lot of us terrorism researchers would discuss would be, all right, well, do you still abide by the same definition of terrorism you did last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, et cetera? How has it changed? Should it change? One of the really, really big challenges for researchers is that what constitutes terrorism will forever itself be a moving target. It will change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But what that means for us as researchers that are in the business of counting, classifying, trying to make sense of what we're looking at. In some ways, ironically, it's not, to pull on one of your other threads, it's not that different to discussions that criminologists have about crime and the nature of crime and the nature of criminality. We don't really talk about the psychology of the criminal anymore. We've got more sophisticated and fine-tuned ways to talk about crime. I think we're sort of on the verge of that when it comes to terrorism, but we've got a long way to go yet.
yeah, we do. There's another viewer with a really good question to look at motivation, John. So she says, in terms of ideologically motivated, how do you distinguish between those that are passive consumers of online content versus those who directly contributed, such as building propaganda? And I want to add a point onto that. How at NCITE here we're looking at mobilization to violence. In your book, you describe the long pathway, and you describe people who are, lots of people can be radicalized. Few of them will actually do something violent. So can you talk a little bit about that arc there?
Sure. I mean, that's the conundrum, really. I mean, that goes right to the heart of I suppose the defining theme of my research. Back in the day when I started this, and I was trying to sort of navigate the complexity of it and trying to figure out what I could contribute to this. Um, uh, I was influenced by people like Max Taylor and Randy Boerum, and they would talk about this notion of progression and the arc of terrorism, as it is being called, for me, very, very simply involves involvement, engagement, and disengagement. And so, there's one set of things that has to do with how and why people become involved. There's another set of things that has to do with, well, all right, what does engagement look like? What does the day-to-day reality of being a terrorist or thinking about it involve? And then the disengagement side of things. I used to say back in the day that my research was all about trying to understand why people become involved in terrorism. I think a better characterization of it is about trying to understand why so few people engage in it? What is it that distinguishes those? Now, I'm not entirely sure that our answers have gotten any better, but I'm to the person's question about motivation. I think increasingly, I think that's a bit of a red herring. I think it is so easy to get to fall down the rabbit hole of motivation questions that we forget that we don't necessarily need to get bogged down in motivation issues for us to figure out solutions to terrorism. That is a very weird thing to say, but I can elaborate on that. The question of mobilization, I think, is key. There has been, almost 2 decades of research in radicalization. I think we now know how and why people get radicalized. We know what kinds of things people go through. We know some of the things that people wrestle with. The problem is not radicalization. The problem has never been radicalization. In the post 9/11 world, and I remember, upsetting a lot of terrorism researchers at the time who sort of felt that I was taking their problem away from them. People saying things like, well, how can you say that radicalization isn't the problem? What I meant by that was that a big assumption in policy circles post 9/11 was that if we are to prevent terrorism, we have to stop radicalization from taking place. I don't agree with that, and I've never agreed with that, because trying to stop radicalization is, quite frankly, trying to stop or police people from acquiring extreme views. Now, we can have all kinds of conversations about the things we need to do to reduce hate. I met some of your wonderful colleagues last week in Pittsburgh at the Eradicate Hate Summit. Those are very, very important and critical conversations to have. I think when it comes to preventing terrorism, we're looking at something much further into the process. We're looking at people who have either of their own volition have decided to mobilize to action, or have had that nudge, have had some online influence, or have a recruiter tapping them on the shoulder to sort of, push them or pull them in a certain way. Ironically, we still know very, very little about what is it that pushes people over the edge, and that's what one of the things that I tried to do in the book.
Yeah, okay.
But it's fundamentally one of the most infuriating and challenging questions in all of terrorism research. We know so much about radicalization.
Right.
We know what the pieces of the puzzle are, but we just don't know how they come together in such a way to provide the perfect picture of what it is that has someone cross over. And we have spent decades trying to reverse engineer that process. And quite frankly, and one of the conclusions I came to early on in the book was that I don't think we're going to have very much success with that at any point in the future, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. Wow. If you could answer that, John, really,
But I think that the point of it was that we can have better success and measurable success by ironically doing something quite different. I'm not saying that motivation doesn't matter. I mean, I would never say to government folks, motivation doesn't matter, because it's important to know where the trend lines are. It's important to know if anti-Semitic ideology is increasing and the extent to which it's increasing and what's driving it. But in terms of preventing individual acts of terrorism, we are ironically far better served by not keeping a very, very narrow focus on the people we call the terrorists. Thanks to research sponsored by DHS, S&T, and NIJ and others, we in the research community have realized now that by looking at by even marginally broadening our focus to friends, family members, coworkers, peers that surround that person, we're actually in a much better position to spot some of those early warning signs.
Which just makes your tornado metaphor all the more apt, right? You may not be able to stop it, but there are umpteen signals out there.
There are things we can do. Yes. Yeah.
And I think
We could be talking about the motivation question for the next 30, 40 years. I have no doubt that we will. I will not be. And to the, I feel like I've sort of dodged the person who asked that question. That's not my intention at all. But right now, we're all locked in a very big discussion, some fascinating discussion with counterterrorism practitioners around this notion of, mixed ideologies and so-called salad bar ideologies, and what does it mean? And important and interesting conversations to have, but I am not convinced that we are doing that in the service of practical preventative steps, because I think it is actually, ironically, I think it is distracting us from that.
Okay, I'm going to ask you what's going to sound like a salad bar question, but it isn't. So stick with me here. This is
Sure.
a reader, but it's something we had kind of discussed too. So one of the things I love about this book, grim as the subject may be, is that you are pulling all kinds of case examples from different countries, different contexts, different ideologies. And Robert, who's watching, is asking, could you comment on the psychological affinities that you see between, say, U.S. domestic violent extremists or foreign violent extremists, and what kind of he's asking two things. So first of all, how are these groups that seem as different as night and day? How are they kind of the same? I think he's asking that. And then the second question is, what kind of tornado siren can we craft? Maybe especially during this electoral period
Yeah,
that has
yeah.
us all kind of in our basements crouching right now, to prepare for that.
Yeah, a multi-part questions, spoken like a true academic, Robert. Thank you. So to the first part of that, and Erin, I want to sort of directly draw on your categorizations there. I think again, I understand why these categorizations exist. I understand why we need to have labels to describe the different phenomena, whether foreign, domestic, et cetera, et cetera. I think those labels and those distinctions are increasingly irrelevant, particularly when it comes to understanding and prevention. One of my roles rather, as a researcher trying to find, some of the psychological themes here, is to figure out what they have in common. And I think once you, again, not saying ideology isn't relevant, of course it's relevant, but once we sort of strip away some of the differences we assume exist between people, and we look underneath the hood of the ideologies that they are experimenting with or flirting with, that's when the similarities start to become apparent. That's when we start to see the themes that they share in common, the sense of moral outrage that fuels their injustice. Today, I mean, we're not talking about people being exposed to some obscure ideological tracts written by somebody in a cave. We're talking about people seeing a civilian suffering on the 6 o'clock news or on social media. We're talking about obviously a shared an acknowledgement and embracing that violence is an appropriate and acceptable solution because no other option is going to work. And we're talking about a shared sense that there's an urgency to act now rather than later. So there's a whole bunch of themes that if you strip away the ideology or at least obscure it for a moment, you'll see that the kinds of things that are present in ethnic or nationalist inspired terrorism are not a million miles removed from people that are involved in religious groups or single issue groups and everything in between. I think partly because we talk about ideology in fairly loose sorts of ways, we tend to assume that they're far more different than they are, but the research says otherwise. To the second part of Robert's question, again, I think that there's so much more that we know about now than we did even 10 years ago when it comes to prevention. I know that a lot of people on this call will be sick and tired of hearing, if you see something, say something. But one of the absolutely groundbreaking developments, and what for me, one of the most exciting sea changes we've seen in terrorism research over the past 20 years, has been the acknowledgement that for reasons I don't think we actually properly understand yet, and that's a whole nother conversation, right? But terrorist offenders leak behavior. They leak their intention. Now, some of this seems to be more apparent for certain types of terrorist offender. We first started to detect this in lone actors. But we know that friends, family, coworkers, peers are often the first people to not just spot the signs of radicalization, but to spot the signs of mobilization. It's not that this behavior and these changes that may or may not signal violent intent can't be seen, but the people that are best suited, are best positioned to spot these changes often don't do anything about it. Question for us as researchers and as practitioners and people trying to figure out solutions here. And this is why I like, engaging with practitioners, because you learn to be very practical in the kinds of questions you think about, is if people are reluctant to report, let's find out why they're reluctant to report. And once we find out why they're reluctant to report, let's address it. Let's figure out what the solutions might be to encourage people to take that step and report what might be suspicious behavior. So that's where, ironically, and I never thought I'd be saying this after all of my, I've spent so many years just with this laser focus on the people we call the terrorists. But when we just step back from it just a little bit and take a little bit more perspective, about a more of a wider lens on this, that's when we start to see the basis of some of the practical solutions here. That there is behavioral leakage. People are able to detect it. So if we can harness what's going on some of the outer edges there, we might actually be in a better position.
John, thank you so much for that. Being solutions focused is always so important in this line of work. You mentioned early on interviews as a method that is ripe for the picking here. And I wonder if you can kind of address what that looks like. What are some of the barriers to conducting interviews and what a successful interview might look like? And let me just say this. I don't know if you've read the book American Mother by Diane Foley, but she was the mother of James Foley, the American journalist who was gruesomely beheaded by ISIS. And she sat down for an interview with one of the perpetrators. And I thought, if she can do that, if she is able to do that as the mother of a victim, how does a practitioner do that in a way that's different than law enforcement, different than the mother of a victim? What does that look like, and what are you hoping to glean?
What I'm hoping to glean from it is a sense of the world from the perpetrators themselves. Now there's plenty of interviews with terrorists that are out there. Some researchers have had a lot of success with this. What we are not seeing is the kind of systematic and comprehensive effort we would need in order to really propel our knowledge of terrorist offenders onto the next level. Why we're not doing it? I mean, there are all kinds of barriers to it. It is virtually impossible for academic researchers to conduct research like this in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And again, it's just talking about Seamus. I wish Seamus was here because we could, complain or talk and brainstorm about this all day long. But we have a problem. We have barriers to access. It is ironically much easier for somebody like me to go to Pakistan or Somalia, as I have done, to listen to accounts of people who have been involved in terrorism than it is to do interviews with people who are who have been incarcerated for terrorist offenses here. Of course, we can interview people who have been released from custody, and a lot of researchers have done that. But one of the points I make in the book is that we just, we keep coming back to this issue time and time and time again. And I'm not the first to say it. Colleagues of mine, Randy Boram, Gary Lafree, John Morrison, Paul Gill, and others, we keep coming back to this, which is, we don't need more theories about radicalization. We don't, we certainly need to figure out the middle bit of it, which is the mobilization question. That's one of the subjects of my next book. But fundamentally, no amount of theorizing, no amount of thinking through what we think about motivation is going to shed light on what it means to the perpetrator. So that's one of the missing bits that we have here. And in the book, I lay out how sometimes it's just baby steps. The extraordinary breakthroughs that the FBI were able to make in the late 1970s by interviewing 36 serial killers, for example, although, there are a lot of limitations with that early research, but what that gave rise to was profound. And what that led to in terms of trying to see the world from the offender's perspective. It doesn't mean we're sympathizing with them. It doesn't mean that we are excusing or reducing the importance of what they do, but we have to see the world from their perspective. We have to understand what ideology means to them. We have to understand their relationship with ideology. We are not going to get that unless we find ways to talk to them, and more importantly, to listen to them. One of the biggest lessons I've learned from people like the FBI, for example, is that some of the best interviews, some of the most effective interviews you can do are when you as a researcher just shut up and allow people to talk. It's not to say that this isn't being done, but it's small scale, it's ad hoc. As occasionally an opportunity comes up to do an interview as part of a case or an investigation or something like that. But we really need to take this on. We need those rich, detailed, ideographic style approaches. And ironically, this was one of the things that terrorism researchers have identified 30, 40 years ago, and we seem to have sort of come full circle. There's so much work done on the manifestos now. There's so much great work being done on propaganda. There's so much great work being done on the bystanders. I keep saying ironically, I'll try to stop that, but what we are missing here is systematic, comprehensive interviewing of the offenders themselves. And it absolutely needs to be done, because otherwise we're going to keep coming back to the same conversations, the same gaps in the research time and time and time again.
Well, of course, you need to get it from the horse's mouth, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
that makes sense. So what flip needs to be switched to reduce the barriers? I mean, that is
The short answer is I don't know. I mean, I think we certainly need conversations with the Bureau of Prisons at an absolute minimum to find out, well, why are researchers not able to go in and do this research? I've had the enormous privilege and benefit to have years and years of interactions with the FBI through their behavioral analysis unit. And I kind of jokingly say to some amazing folks there, look, if we can't do it as researchers, then you should be doing it, but somebody needs to do it, so somebody needs to get in there and do this stuff systematically and collect this data, because researchers are just coming up against walls every single time. And I don't want this to sound like sour grapes or anything like that, but I have had those discussions, and I went about 2 years engaging with the BOP on this several years ago, and in the end, it just went nowhere. So it's super frustrating, and the barriers seem to be more about power and politics than anything else. And again, this is not about researchers just asking for some sort of privileged access. This is about trying to realize the benefits for all concerned, if we are able to at least entertain the idea that this is something we should be doing. Because the offenders themselves want to talk to us. I mean, they've got their own motivations for wanting to talk to us. They've got their own agendas, obviously, but they will talk to us. So why we are unable to get in and have these conversations and collect this data in a way that we can do, it's not rocket science. It's just
Well,
behavior.
duly noted, and let's just commit to like a part two on this subject of the interviews in and of itself. Especially as I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, okay, I've got 10 minutes. I've got so much I want to ask John. So one of the questions I want to get to is horizon scanning, and you say this so well in your book, and I'll just butcher it, but you talk about a problem with terrorism research is its event. It's like it's the anatomy of the event, right? The event
Yeah,
is happening.
yeah.
Let's go look at it. And you're looking like, well, let's future cast. What are we seeing? And I think everybody is kind of saying, yeah, hey, crystal ball this for us, John, And so when you look at this moment that we are in, and take out the election, just look at this moment we are in globally. And look at what is happening in the Middle East. What should we be aware of? What should practitioners and what should the academic community be thinking about and planning for?
I almost don't want to answer that question, because, and I will. So much has been said about what's happening in the Middle East. I mean, obviously, events started with this appalling attack on Israel on the 7th of October last year, has given rise to a catastrophic humanitarian disaster. I have so and trying to think about how that is going to say how it's going to play out, just even that sounds offensive. So I'm trying to figure out, how to even talk about it, let alone think about it. I will say, from a very narrow view on the world, um, it's hard to see how we won't see waves of international terrorism come from this. There's so much hurt out there. There's so much suffering. There's so much identification with the suffering that's going on, that it is already in real time inspiring and radicalizing a whole new generation of kids who will feel that they don't have a voice, who will feel that there is nothing in conventional politics that can be done for them, and they will consider terrorism as an option. That is absolutely going to happen. And otherwise, every single one of our models, every single one of our theories is incorrect. I'd rather that be the case, but it's just not going to happen. Um, uh, I mean, yeah, we could talk about, the domestic scene all day long. Uh, we'll see. We'll see. I think the point I want to sort of make as a researcher, and this is kind of me punting a little bit here, is that the time to figure out what our approach should be, the time to figure out our strategy, is not in the midst of chaos. There's always going to be flashpoints. Terrorism is always going to find new ways to express itself. There's always going to be, a new little thing that forces us to say, oh, hey, here's this new little shiny thing, and maybe we should pay attention to that. The unenviable challenge we have, as whether we're academics or practitioners or something else, is that we have to keep an eye on all of it at the same time. And I think right now we're at a time when there are more opportunities to get involved in terrorism than ever before. Again, one of the reasons I needed to write this book was just to sort of capture how much the internet has absolutely heralded in an evolutionary marker in terrorism today. An area of activity that used to be, the purview of sort of, young, angry males is now equal opportunities for everybody. It's men, women, children, all ages. We're seeing what appears to be a very worrying but very real trend of younger and younger and younger offenders. And I don't think we're remotely ready for the challenges associated with that. So it's a whole topic, all to itself. I'm happy to come back and do an hour on that, but the trends are as numerous as they are diverse and complex. And I wouldn't even how offensive it would be to reduce the tragedy of the Middle East to just this one symptom of terrorism that is going to come. But I think that will be just one of many challenges that will come from this in years to come.
Well, I think that's a very fair answer, and I appreciate that. And you're right that that issue is owed a lot of fairness to the question. I am going to completely steal from Ezra Klein from the New York Times. He always asks his guests what 3 books they should read, and I love that question because we started off this conversation. Our viewers don't even know before they enter the room. Do people read anymore, and what should they read? And so let's encourage that. What are 3 books that you could recommend?
So I knew you were going to ask me this question. So of course I've spent the morning assembling 28 books.
Of course, this is one. This is
Well,
one.
all right. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please read Terrorist Minds.
Shameless,
Yeah, you're
yeah.
funding my my mountaineering bank account here. So I'm going to be cheeky. I'm going to take advantage of having the platform for a second because there's terrorism books. There's books that I'm reading right now, and then there's books that have really some of my very favorite and near to my heart books. So a few years ago, my good buddy and friend Lynn Pitts introduced me to the work of Sebastian Junger, and I've just been on a Junger kick for a few years now. But this one, Freedom, is just one of the most profound books that I've ever read, and it's not a terrorism book. I'll give you a few terrorism books in a minute, but that is I keep coming back to this, and I keep revisiting it. I have just finished this incredible book, Gary Paulson's Winter Dance. This is about a guy from the Midwest who competed in, and I won't tell you if he completed it or not, the Iditarod. And again, just one of those profound books that has left a mark. And one of my all-time favorite books by one of my all-time favorite artists is M Train by Patti Smith. And for a variety of reasons I won't get into, I've been coming back to that book of late. So if you want books every single human should read, those three. Now, to talk about work. This is a book by Claire Alley. This is called the Psychology of Extreme Violence. Now, I had a great opportunity to collaborate with Claire on a recent article we wrote on about school psychology, and Randy Borum and others. We did this earlier this year, in fact, talk about violent extremism in school settings. What I love about Claire's work is that she does a tremendous job of explaining the importance of ideographic approaches, case studies to all forms of targeted violence. And so that has really shaped and helped my thinking on these issues. I'm reading a really excellent book right now about the 1982 Prince's Gate siege in London. Ben Macintyre, I love Ben Macintyre's work, so anything he writes is terrific. But this is about the siege and the SAS raid, fabulous work. One of my absolute heroes is Clarissa Ward. Some of you, I'm sure, will know her from her work as a war correspondent, senior international correspondent on CNN. She is so much more than that. She is a humanitarian extraordinaire. She runs a charity aimed at helping children affected by war and conflict. But on all fronts is her memoir of covering conflict, and it's just it's an electric read from just an extraordinary human being. So I'd urge you to check that out. And one last one, and this would be in my top 5 books I've ever read on terrorism. It's from the journalist Joby Warwick, and this book is The Triple Agent. And it's the story of Humam al-Bilawi, the so-called triple agent that some of you Al-Qaeda watchers will be familiar with. But an astonishing story of just how complicated and tricky it can be to do counterterrorism in a messy world. And it's one of the themes in that I'm exploring for my new book. And yeah, this is one of the absolute best books that has ever been written about terrorism, and I highly recommend it to everybody. So I've got many more, Erin, but I know we're being pushed for time, but yeah.
Well, I think this just means we have to talk more and then be good friends and talk about Patti Smith. So we'll put a pin in that, John. But thank you to everyone who signed on to watch this. John, thank you so much for your time today. So much more to talk about. And so to be continued is how we'll end this.
Pleasure. Thank you for allowing me to ramble and moan and groan and pontificate. And I appreciate the invitation.
With that, we'll end for our audience. Take care, everybody, and have a good day.